when a tough, leather-clad biker from the feared Iron Serpents gang boarded Flight 417, he thought he owned the room. But when James Reaper Reynolds laughed at a tribute for a fallen soldier, calling it a waste of time, he had no idea the quiet man sitting behind him, a battle-hardened war hero, was about to put him in his place and teach him a lesson he'd never forget. The steady hum of jet engines filled the cabin as Flight 417 climbed through the clouds above Dallas. Private Emily Ross sat straight-backed in her blue service uniform, hands folded neatly in her lap, trying to project the calm dignity expected of her role today. Her eyes kept drifting to the cargo hold beneath her feet, where a flag-draped coffin held the remains of Sergeant Andre Taylor. She'd never met Andre, but after spending the past day accompanying his body, she felt like she knew him. His personnel file told the story of a dedicated soldier, the kind who always volunteered for the tough assignments. The kind who died, making sure everyone else made it out alive. Now, she was his escort on this final journey home to New York. The fasten seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers began settling in for the 3-hour flight. Emily watched them, businessmen tapping away on laptops, families corralling energetic kids, elderly couples sharing crossword puzzles, normal people living normal lives, probably giving little thought to the heroes who made such normalcy possible. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." The usual announcements about weather and flight time followed, but then his tone shifted. "I want to inform you that we have the honor of carrying a fallen American hero on our flight today. Sergeant Andre Taylor is returning home, and we ask that you remain seated upon landing as a sign of respect while his casket is transferred to the honor guard waiting to receive him." A respectful hush fell over the cabin. Several passengers bowed their heads. An older woman across the aisle dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Emily felt a surge of pride in her fellow Americans until a harsh laugh cut through the silence. "Oh, give me a break." The words came from the back of the plane. Emily turned, along with most other passengers, to see a hulking figure sprawled across 2 seats in the last row. His leather jacket was decorated with patches, a coiled snake wrapped around a skull, the words, "Iron Serpents MC," curved above it. Heavy boots were propped up on the seat in front of him, and a scraggly beard framed his sneering face. "The Army's not that important," he announced to the cabin at large. "They're just paid to fight and die. Big deal." Emily felt like she'd been slapped. Her hands clenched in her lap as she fought to maintain her composure. A few rows behind her, she heard someone inhale sharply. In her peripheral vision, she saw an older man in a blazer sit up straighter, his shoulders squaring with military precision. The biker's buddy, wearing a matching jacket, chuckled and held up his hand for a high five. Their palms slapped together with a crack that seemed to echo through the suddenly tense cabin. Emily forced herself to look forward, reminding herself that her duty was to Andre. She wouldn't let some ignorant civilian's disrespect distract her from that sacred task. But she could feel the weight of the biker's presence behind her, like a storm cloud threatening rain. And she knew, with the certainty that comes from years of military experience, that this flight was about to get very interesting. The man in the blazer who had reacted to the biker's outburst was Colonel Robert Hayes, though none of the other passengers knew that yet. 30 years in the Air Force had taught him to spot trouble coming, and right now his instincts were screaming. He studied the biker's reflection in the window beside him. The patches on the leather jacket told a story to those who knew how to read them. The Iron Serpents weren't just weekend warriors playing at being outlaws. They were the real deal, with chapters across 3 states and a reputation for violence. The skull patch on the biker's shoulder marked him as a full member, not just a prospect. The lightning bolt below, it was harder to spot, but Hayes recognized it. It meant this guy had done time. No wonder he was so comfortable being the center of negative attention. A flight attendant passed by, her practiced smile a little strained. Hayes caught her eye and gave her a reassuring nod. He dealt with worse than some punk with authority issues. Much worse. The scars under his jacket proved that. The young soldier in her dress blues, Hayes could see her name tag read Ross, was handling herself well. But he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw clenched every time the biker made another loud comment. She was probably fresh out of basic, and this escort duty was likely her first real test. Having some low-life mock her mission had to be eating at her. These military types think they're so special, the biker was saying now, his voice pitched to Carrie. Like we should all bow down and worship them or something. My tax dollars pay their salary. That makes me their boss, right? His friend cackled again. Hayes noticed other passengers shifting uncomfortably, some shooting angry glances toward the back of the plane, others deliberately focusing on their books or tablets. Nobody wanted to be the one to challenge the two burly bikers. Hayes understood their reluctance. He'd seen the damage the Iron Serpents could do when they felt disrespected. But he'd also seen what happened when good people stayed silent in the face of wrong. He'd learned that lesson the hard way in Kosovo, watching villages burn because someone should have spoken up sooner. He wasn't about to let this punk dishonor a fallen soldier just because confrontation might be uncomfortable. Hayes checked his watch. 2 hours and 40 minutes left in the flight. Plenty of time for things to either settle down or blow up completely. Given the biker's attitude and the growing tension in the cabin, he was betting on the latter. He caught Private Ross's eye and gave her a subtle nod, soldier to soldier. She straightened almost imperceptibly, drawing strength from the silent support. Hayes settled back in his seat, keeping his breathing steady and his senses alert. Sometimes the best move was to wait for your opponent to make a mistake. And if his read on the situation was right, this biker, this James Reaper Reynolds, according to the name patch on his jacket, was just getting started. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude, the gentle vibration of the engines a stark contrast to the emotional turbulence building in the cabin. Hayes could feel it in his bones. This flight was about to become a battle of wills. And he hadn't lost one of those since Sarajevo in '95. The flight attendants had just finished their first beverage service when James decided to really start putting on a show. He'd switched seats with his buddy to get closer to the aisle, making sure everyone could hear him as he launched into stories about his motorcycle club's exploits. His voice carried through the cabin like a foghorn, drowning out the engine noise and the polite conversations around him. So there we were, 30 of us rolling down the highway, and this cop tries to pull us over. James gestured broadly, nearly hitting a passing passenger. Like one guy with a badge is gonna stop the Iron Serpents. We just kept riding. What's he gonna do? Chase all of us? Emily tried to focus on the book in her lap, but the words blurred together. Each laugh from the back of the plane felt like sandpaper on her nerves. She'd been taught to maintain her bearing no matter what, but this was testing every bit of her training. Hey, soldier girl. James called out suddenly. You get paid better than the cops? Maybe that's why they sign up. No cop ever got a parade for dying on the job, right? Emily's hands trembled slightly as she turned the page, pretending not to hear. A few seats away, a mother pulled her young son closer, shooting an angry look toward the back of the plane. The boy had been watching Emily with wide-eyed fascination since boarding, clearly impressed by her uniform. Now he looked confused by the mocking tone in James's voice. What's wrong? Can't hear me up there. Those fancy medals blocking your ears. James's buddy snickered, encouraging him. Or maybe they don't teach you to talk to civilians in basic training. Just how to follow orders like good little robots. Colonel Hayes watched the scene unfold, noting how other passengers were reacting. A businessman in first class had taken off his headphones, frowning at the disruption. 2 college students who'd been chatting quietly about their spring break plans fell silent, exchanging uncomfortable glances. An elderly man who'd earlier mentioned serving in Vietnam gripped his armrest, so tight his knuckles went white. The tension was spreading through the cabin like smoke, thick and suffocating. Hayes had seen this kind of situation before, one person pushing boundaries, testing how far they could go before someone pushed back. The fact that James was targeting a young soldier specifically set Hayes's teeth on edge. But he'd learned through decades of service that timing was everything. React too soon, and you could make things worse. Wait too long and you lose the initiative. A flight attendant approached Hayes's row, presumably drawn by his military bearing and the way other passengers kept glancing his way for guidance. She leaned down, keeping her voice low. "Sir, I noticed your service pin," she said, gesturing to his lapel where a small Air Force emblem was pinned. "We're trying to handle the situation, but if things escalate..." Hayes nodded understanding. "I've got eyes on it," he assured her quietly. "Let's give him a chance to settle down on his own first. Sometimes people just need to get attention-seeking behavior out of their system." But watching Emily's rigid posture, seeing the way she blinked rapidly to hold back tears when James launched into another mocking impression of a drill sergeant, Hayes doubted this would resolve itself peacefully. The girl was doing her best to maintain her composure, but everyone had a breaking point. And James seemed determined to find hers. Hayes carefully made his way to Emily's row during a moment when James was distracted by his phone. He slipped into the empty seat beside her, moving with the practiced ease of someone used to operating in tense situations. "At ease, Private," he said softly, noting how she instantly recognized the command in his voice. "Colonel Robert Hayes, retired Air Force. You're doing a fine job maintaining your bearing." Emily's shoulders relaxed slightly, though she kept her eyes forward. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. "I just keep thinking about Sergeant Taylor's family waiting at the airport. They shouldn't have to hear about any disrespect to their son." Hayes nodded, understanding completely. He'd been on both sides of the situation, the one doing the escorting and the one being escorted home. Neither role was easy, but doing it under fire from some loudmouth civilian made it infinitely harder. From the back of the plane, James had started a new round of commentary. "You know what the difference is between the military and a street gang?" he asked loudly. "At least gang members are honest about what they are. Military just pretends they're better than everyone else." His buddy chimed in with his own observation. "Yeah, and they get all these special privileges. Like making everyone wait while they unload a box just because it has a flag on it." Hayes felt Emily tense beside him. He'd seen the patches on James's jacket. The Iron Serpents weren't just any motorcycle club. They had a reputation for violence, drug running, and territorial disputes with other gangs. The irony of them criticizing the military wasn't lost on him. A flight attendant passed by, giving Hayes a meaningful look. Earlier, she'd recognized his service pin and quietly asked if he could help if things got out of hand. He'd assured her he would, but also advised waiting to see if the situation resolved itself. Now, watching James get more aggressive with his comments, Hayes was starting to think intervention might be necessary sooner rather than later. "How much longer until landing?" Emily asked softly, her voice steady despite the strain showing around her eyes. "About 2 hours," Hayes replied. "Think you can maintain your bearing that long, soldier?" Emily squared her shoulders. "Yes, sir. Sergeant Taylor deserves nothing less." Hayes felt a surge of pride in the young private's dedication. He'd served with soldiers like Andre Taylor, men and women who gave everything for their country. And he'd served with soldiers like Emily Ross, who understood that honor and duty didn't end when a comrade fell. Behind them, James had switched to telling stories about run-ins with military MPs at bars near various bases. Each tale painted soldiers as arrogant and entitled, looking for special treatment because of their uniforms. His buddy egged him on, adding his own embellishments that grew more outrageous with each telling. Other passengers had given up any pretense of not listening, their faces showing various degrees of discomfort and anger. The elderly Vietnam vet had put in earphones, his expression dark. The mother had moved her curious son to a seat further away, trying to shield him from James's increasingly coarse language. Hayes recognized the signs of a situation approaching its boiling point. Sometimes the hardest part of leadership was knowing exactly when to step in. Too soon, and you could escalate things unnecessarily. Too late, and you'd lose control entirely. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, rattling the overhead bins. Hayes noticed James didn't even pause his ranting to grab his armrest like everyone else. The biker was too focused on his performance, too caught up in his own sense of power over the situation. That kind of tunnel vision could be dangerous. Hayes had seen it before, in combat and in civilian life. People so focused on proving their own toughness that they couldn't see the storm gathering around them. As the plane steadied, he made his decision. The next time James crossed a line, he would act. Sometimes respect had to be taught the hard way. The plane shuddered as it hit another patch of turbulence, more severe this time. The seatbelt sign dinged on with a sharp chime, followed by the captain's voice asking everyone to return to their seats. Most passengers quickly complied, but James remained sprawled in his seat, legs stretched into the aisle. "Sir, you need to buckle up," a flight attendant said, steadying herself against a seat as the plane jerked again. James looked up at her with half-lidded eyes and a lazy smile. "What's gonna happen? Am I gonna fall up?" His buddy snickered, and James's grin widened. "Besides, I don't do well with authority figures telling me what to do. Ask any cop who's tried." The flight attendant's professional smile tightened. "It's not about authority, sir. It's about safety. Federal regulations require dash." "Federal regulations?" James cut her off with a bark of laughter. "What are they gonna do? Arrest me midair?" He turned to his friend. "Hey, maybe they'll call in the military." "Oh wait, they're only good at following orders, not giving them." Emily's hands clenched in her lap. The turbulence rattled the plane again, and she could see the flight attendant struggling to maintain her balance while dealing with James. Other passengers were turning in their seats, the tension in the cabin rising with each passing moment. That's when Colonel Hayes decided he'd seen enough. He stood smoothly despite the plane's movement, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "That's enough." The single phrase, delivered with the kind of authority that could only come from decades of command, brought an immediate hush to the cabin. James's head snapped around, his eyes narrowing as Hayes stepped into the aisle. "Who the hell are you supposed to be?" James demanded, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his expression now. Hayes cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of steady gaze that had stared down worse threats than an oversized biker with something to prove. "Someone who's heard enough disrespect for one day," Hayes replied evenly. He moved down the aisle with deliberate steps, ignoring another wave of turbulence. "You seem to think wearing that jacket makes you tough. That snake on your back makes you someone to fear. But I've met real tough guys, son. Men who didn't need patches to prove their worth." James started to stand, but Hayes's next words froze him in place. "Sergeant Andre Taylor was one of them. The man whose coffin you've been mocking? He died making sure every member of his unit made it out of an ambush alive. He threw himself on a grenade to save his friends. That's real toughness. That's real sacrifice." The plane bucked again, but no one seemed to notice. All eyes were locked on the confrontation unfolding in the narrow aisle. James's buddy had shrunk back in his seat, suddenly very interested in looking anywhere but at Hayes. James tried to recover his bravado, puffing up his chest. "You don't know anything about tough. Me and my brothers, we live by our own code. We don't bow down to anyone. We dash." "Your code?" Hayes's quiet laugh held no humor. "Let me tell you about codes. I served with Andre's father in Afghanistan. Man named Marcus Taylor. He lived by a code too. Never leave a man behind. Never break your word. Never dishonor the uniform. He pulled 3 men out of a burning Humvee while under sniper fire. Lost his leg doing it. But he never complained. Never wanted recognition. Just said it was his duty." The turbulence had settled, but the tension in the cabin remained electric. Passengers leaned forward, caught up in Hayes's words. Even the children seemed to sense the importance of the moment, staying unusually quiet. "You talk about your brotherhood?" Hayes continued, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "I've seen real brotherhood. I've watched soldiers share their last water in 100-degree heat. Seen them carry wounded comrades for miles through mountain passes. Watched them risk their lives for people they'd never met, simply because it was the right thing to do." Emily stood up then, her voice shaking slightly but growing stronger with each word. "Sergeant Taylor was leading a patrol when they were ambushed. They were pinned down, taking heavy fire. He could have called for air support, could have ordered a retreat. Instead, he advanced alone, drawing fire so his unit could get to better positions." She pulled out her phone, hands steady now. This was his last message to his family. Her voice carried clearly as she read, "Mom, Dad, don't worry about me. The men in my unit, they're my responsibility. I'll make sure they all make it home. That's what matters." James shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His earlier swagger had evaporated, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. But his pride wouldn't let him back down completely. "Look, I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did." Hayes cut him off. "You meant every word. You wanted to show everyone how tough you are, how little you care about authority or respect or sacrifice. But here's what you don't understand. True strength isn't about intimidation. It's not about patches or attitude or making others feel small." The plane had begun its initial descent, the slight change in pressure making ears pop. But nobody moved, all attention focused and the confrontation playing out before them. True strength, Hayes continued, is about standing up for something bigger than yourself. It's about sacrifice, duty, and honor. Things that Sergeant Taylor understood. Things that Private Ross here understands. Things that your patches and your tough guy act can't even begin to touch. James opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since takeoff, he seemed to have nothing to say. His buddy had become intensely interested in the safety card in the seat pocket, clearly wanting no part of the conversation anymore. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their approach to New York. Hayes held James's gaze for a moment longer, then turned to head back to his seat. As he passed Emily, she straightened and gave him a slight nod, soldier to soldier, guardian to guardian of a fallen hero's final journey home. James stared out the window as the plane descended through the clouds, but his usual cocky expression had cracked. Hayes's words had hit home harder than any punch, leaving him struggling to maintain his tough guy facade. The colonel's story about pulling injured soldiers from burning wreckage kept playing in his head, mixing uncomfortably with memories he'd tried to bury. "You know what real courage looks like?" Hayes's voice carried from a few rows ahead, where he'd turned to face James again. "It's not about being fearless. It's about being terrified and doing what needs to be done anyway. I've seen it firsthand." The plane banked slightly, sunlight streaming through the windows. Hayes's eyes seemed to look past James, seeing something far away and long ago. "We were hit by a rocket in Kandahar. The Humvee flipped, caught fire. I could smell burning fuel, burning flesh. My leg was trapped, but I could hear Thompson screaming in the back. Kid was just 19. Other passengers listened in complete silence. Even the baby, who'd been fussy earlier, seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. James found himself leaning forward despite himself, caught up in the story. The flames were spreading fast. Thompson was pinned under what was left of the radio equipment. I managed to free my leg, could have crawled out the broken windshield, but that would have meant leaving him. Hayes paused, his hand unconsciously touching his side where burned scars still marked his skin. So, I crawled back instead. Spent 3 minutes in that inferno, getting him loose. Felt like 3 years. Emily watched James's face, seeing something shift behind his eyes. The sneer was gone, replaced by something more complex, discomfort, maybe even understanding. "Thompson made it," Hayes continued. "Lost his left arm, but he made it. Last month, he sent me pictures of his newborn daughter. Said he named her Hope because that's what got him through those 3 minutes. Hope that someone would come for him. Hope that he wasn't alone." James tried to rally, to find his earlier bravado. "That's real nice and all, but businessmen contribute more to society than Dash." Hayes cut him off with a look that could have frozen hell itself. "You want to talk about contribution? Let me tell you about what soldiers contribute. They contribute their youth, their safety, their peace of mind. Some contribute limbs, others their lives. They contribute knowing their families might have to watch them come home in a flag-draped coffin like the one below our feet." The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. A businessman in an expensive suit who'd earlier been complaining about flight delays wiped at his eyes with his tie. A college student who'd been recording parts of the confrontation on her phone lowered it slowly, realizing some moments shouldn't be turned into social media content. Emily reached into her bag with steady hands, pulling out a worn envelope. "Before we left base, Sergeant Taylor's mother gave me this. It's the last letter he wrote home." She smoothed the creased paper, her voice clear and strong despite the emotion behind it. "Dear Mom and Dad, I know you worry, but please don't. The men and women I serve with, they're more than just my unit. They're my family. Yesterday, Martinez showed me pictures of his kid's first birthday party. Chen's teaching me Mandarin so I can surprise his grandmother when we get home. Williams keeps everyone laughing with her terrible jokes. James's buddy had stopped trying to look tough, his own eyes growing suspiciously bright. Several passengers were openly crying now, touched by the simple humanity in Andre's words. "I need you to understand something," the letter continued. "If anything happens to me, know that I was exactly where I wanted to be, doing exactly what I believed in. We're not here for glory or recognition. We're here because someone has to be. Someone has to stand between the darkness and the light. Someone has to say, 'Not on my watch.'" The plane hit another patch of turbulence, but nobody seemed to notice. Emily's voice grew stronger as she read on. "Last week, we helped build a school in a village that's never had one. You should have seen the kids' faces, Mom. They looked at us like we were angels. One little girl gave me her only toy, a ragged doll she'd made herself. Said it was to remember her by. That's why we're here. Not for medals or parades, but for her. For every kid who deserves a chance at a better future." James stared at his hands, his fingers tracing the skull ring he wore, a symbol of toughness that suddenly felt hollow. The letter's words struck something deep inside him, something he'd buried under years of anger and defiance. "I love you both. Don't worry about me. I'm surrounded by heroes every day. They're not the kind you see in movies, they're better. They're real. They're the ones who do what needs to be done, not for glory or recognition, but because it's right. If anything happens to me, know that I died among friends, doing what I believed in. There's no better way to go. Love, Andre." The cabin fell silent except for the hum of engines. Emily carefully folded the letter and put it away. Hayes watched James, seeing the internal struggle playing across his face. The biker's tough exterior had cracked, revealing glimpses of something more vulnerable underneath. "Your father," Hayes said quietly, his words meant only for James, but carrying in the hushed cabin. "He served in Vietnam, didn't he?" James's head snapped up, surprise and pain flashing across his features before he could hide them. His hand moved unconsciously to touch a silver chain around his neck, mostly hidden under his jacket. For the first time since takeoff, his voice held no trace of mockery or defiance, just raw, unguarded emotion. "How did you know?" "The way you react to authority. The anger. I've seen it before in children of Vietnam vets. They came home to a country that didn't want to understand. Many turned that pain inward or passed it on to their families." James swallowed hard, his facade crumbling further with each word. The plane began its final descent into New York, but the story unfolding in the cabin held everyone's attention more surely than any turbulence could shake. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom as the plane descended through the last layer of clouds. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach into JFK International. Once again, we ask that you remain seated after landing while we assist Private Ross in escorting Sergeant Taylor home." James shifted in his seat, his earlier bravado completely gone. The silver chain around his neck felt heavier now, the dog tags hidden beneath his shirt pressing against his chest like a weight. He hadn't worn his father's tags in years, but today something had made him put them on. Through the window, the sprawl of New York City appeared below, buildings catching the afternoon sun. The plane banked, and James caught a glimpse of his reflection in the glass, the leather jacket, the patches, the carefully cultivated image of toughness. For the first time in years, he wondered what his father would think of the man he'd become. "Everyone remember to remain seated," a flight attendant announced, moving through the cabin to check seat belts. She paused near James, her earlier wariness replaced by something softer as she noticed his changed demeanor. "Sir, your seatbelt, please." This time, James complied without comment. His buddy glanced at him uncertainly, clearly unsure how to handle this new, quieter version of his friend. The plane descended lower, the rattle of landing gear extending vibrating through the cabin. Emily sat straight-backed in her seat, preparing herself for what came next. She'd done this duty before, but it never got easier. Each fallen soldier she escorted home left an imprint on her heart. a reminder of the cost of service that some people never seem to understand. Hayes watched James through the reflection in his own window. He'd seen that look before, the moment when a tough exterior cracked, revealing the pain underneath. It reminded him of a young sergeant he'd counseled years ago, another child of Vietnam who'd spent years running from his father's shadows. The plane touched down with a gentle bump, tires squealing slightly on wet tarmac. As they taxied toward the gate, passengers began the usual routine of gathering belongings and checking phones. But there was a different energy in the cabin now, a sense of shared experience that had transformed a simple flight into something more meaningful. "Sir," Emily said quietly to Hayes, "thank you for everything." Hayes nodded, understanding all she wasn't saying. Sometimes the hardest part of their duty wasn't the physical challenges or the dangers, it was maintaining dignity and composure in the face of disrespect. Today, she'd done both admirably. The plane came to a stop at the gate, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. Several passengers reached for their bags out of habit, then quickly sat back down, remembering the captain's request. James started to rise, his old defiance flickering briefly. "Sit down, son." Hayes's voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of command. "It's time to show some respect." James hesitated, caught between ingrained rebellion and something deeper, something that pulled at him like gravity. His buddy had already shrunk back into his seat, but James remained half-standing, suspended between two choices. Through the window, he could see the honor guard assembling on the tarmac, their uniforms crisp in the afternoon sun. A hearse waited nearby, its flags fluttering in the breeze. The sight stirred something in James's memory. Another day, another ceremony, watching through a child's eyes as soldiers folded a flag with precise, careful movements. "Your father," Hayes said quietly, now standing in the aisle beside him. "Did he get a ceremony like this?" James sank slowly back into his seat, his voice rough.
"No. He didn't want one."
Said he didn't deserve it. Died alone in a VA hospital room. Wouldn't even let me call his old unit. The other passengers remained silently seated, many bowing their heads as the ground crew began preparations to unload the cargo hold. The flight attendant who dealt with James earlier stood at the front of the cabin, tears visible in her eyes. Emily rose from her seat, straightening her uniform with practiced precision. She would be the first to exit, taking her place beside the cargo hold to oversee the transfer. As she moved toward the front, passengers reached out to touch her arm, whisper thanks, offer silent nods of respect. James watched her pass, seeing not just a young soldier now, but a link in a chain that stretched back through time, to Andre Taylor, to his own father, to countless others who had served and sacrificed. The patches on his jacket suddenly felt like a costume, a child's attempt at playing tough guy. The cargo hold door opened with a hydraulic hiss audible, even inside the cabin. Through the windows, passengers could see the honor guard snapping to attention, moving with choreographed precision toward the plane. Emily descended the stairs to take her position, her back straight, her movements precise. Hayes remained standing beside James's seat, not blocking him, but present. A reminder that choices made in moments like these revealed more about a person's character than any patches or poses ever could. "It's not too late," Hayes said softly. "Not too late to be the kind of man your father hoped you'd become." Outside, the honor guard began their solemn duty. Inside, a man in a leather jacket covered with symbols of defiance sat very still, watching through the window as his carefully constructed walls began to crumble. The honor guard moved with practiced precision as they approached the cargo hold. Emily stood at attention, her posture perfect despite the emotional weight of the moment. Inside the cabin, passengers watched in respectful silence through the windows, many wiping away tears. James sat completely still, his earlier swagger replaced by something more complex. His hands kept moving to the dog tags hidden under his shirt, touching them like a talisman. When he finally stood, it wasn't with his usual aggressive posture. Instead, he moved carefully, almost hesitantly, toward Emily. His buddy tried to grab his arm. "Man, what are you doing?" James shook him off without a word. Other passengers watched warily, unsure what to expect from the man who'd caused so much trouble during the flight. Hayes observed closely, but didn't intervene. Sometimes he knew you had to let a person find their own way to redemption. Emily tensed slightly as James approached, but maintained her composure. She'd dealt with harder situations during her service. But when James spoke, his voice was different, rougher, more vulnerable, stripped of its earlier mockery. "My dad." He swallowed hard, struggling with words that seemed to catch in his throat. He was in Vietnam. 3rd Marine Division. He never talked about it, not really. Just sat in his garage drinking, staring at nothing. I used to hate him for that, for not being the father I thought I deserved. Around them, the other passengers listened in absolute silence. The college student who'd been recording earlier kept her phone down, understanding that some moments were too private, too raw for social media. "I was 12 when he started getting sick. Agent Orange," the doctor said. "He refused to go to the VA at first. Said they didn't help when his friends needed it, so why should they help him? By the time we convinced him to go, it was too late." Emily's expression softened slightly, though she maintained her professional bearing. She'd seen enough veterans' families to recognize the pain behind James's words. The cost of war didn't stop at the battlefield. It rippled through generations, creating waves of trauma that some people spent their whole lives trying to escape. "He died alone," James continued, his voice cracking. "Wouldn't let anyone from his unit know. Said he didn't deserve their respect, that he'd failed them somehow. I was so angry at him, at the military, at the whole system. Started running with the Iron Serpents because they were everything he wasn't. Loud, proud, in your face." Hayes moved closer, his presence supportive rather than confrontational now. He'd heard variations of this story too many times. Sons and daughters of Vietnam vets trying to understand fathers who came home changed, who couldn't or wouldn't explain what they'd been through. Outside, the honor guard had reached the cargo hold. The sound of their synchronized footsteps carried faintly through the cabin walls. James watched them through the window, his tough guy mask completely gone now, replaced by raw emotion. "I never understood him," he said, pulling the dog tags out from under his shirt. They caught the sunlight streaming through the window, the engraved name still visible despite years of wear. Reynolds, Michael J. Never understood why he wouldn't talk about it, wouldn't let anyone help. Wouldn't even let me put his service on his headstone. Just wanted to disappear. Emily looked at the tags, understanding flowing between them. Every soldier knew what those small pieces of metal represented. Not just identification, but identity, belonging, sacrifice. "Your father's generation," Hayes said quietly. "They came home to a different America. No welcome parades, no thank you for your service. Just silence and confusion, and a country that wanted to forget. Many of them turned that pain inward, tried to protect their families by keeping the darkness to themselves." James nodded, tears falling freely now. "I wear his tags sometimes. Don't know why. Maybe trying to understand him better. Maybe trying to feel closer to who he was before." He gestured vaguely, encompassing all the unspoken pain between fathers and sons. Through the windows, they could see the honor guard positioning themselves around the cargo hold. Emily needed to take her place soon, but something held her there, sensing James needed to finish. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "For everything I said. For dishonoring him. For dishonoring all of them." His hand tightened around the dog tags. He deserved better. They all do. Hayes stepped forward, placing a steady hand on James's shoulder. "It's not too late to honor his memory. To be the kind of man he hoped you'd become before the war changed him." The cargo hold door opened with a metallic groan. Emily straightened, preparing to perform her duty. But before she moved, she turned to James one last time. "Would you like to help?" she asked softly. "Stand with us?" James looked at her in surprise, then at Hayes, who nodded encouragingly. His buddy in the back seat watched in confusion as James slowly removed his leather jacket, carefully folding it to hide the gang patches. Underneath, he wore a simple black t-shirt that made him look younger, more vulnerable. The dog tags caught the light again as he moved toward the door. In that moment, he wasn't a tough guy biker or a rebellious son. He was just a man trying to make peace with his past, one small act of respect at a time. "Sergeant Taylor," he said quietly, almost to himself, "thank you for your service." And Dad, I think I'm starting to understand. Together, they moved toward the cargo hold, where the honor guard waited to perform their sacred duty. Inside the cabin, passengers watched in respectful silence as a story of redemption unfolded before them, proof that it's never too late to choose a better path. 3 weeks after Flight 417 landed, James sat in his garage, staring at his leather jacket hanging on the wall. The Iron Serpents patches seemed different now, like relics from another life. His phone buzzed, another message from his old riding buddy, wondering why he hadn't been around lately. James left it unanswered, like all the others. Instead, he picked up a different phone number, scribbled on a napkin from the airport coffee shop where Hayes had talked with him for hours after the flight. He'd been carrying it around ever since, working up the courage to make the call. The local VA office answered on the third ring. "Yes, I'm interested in volunteering," James heard himself say, his voice steady despite his nerves. "Particularly with Vietnam-era vets, if possible." The coordinator, who took his information, didn't know about Flight 417, about the transformation that had started miles above the clouds. She just heard a man with a rough voice asking how he could help, and that was enough. Later that week, James walked into his first VA volunteer orientation. He'd traded his gang colors for a plain black jacket, his father's dog tags now worn up, only around his neck. The other volunteers gave him curious looks. With his tattoos and beard, he didn't fit the usual profile. But when he spoke about wanting to help veterans who felt forgotten, about understanding the silence that could grow between fathers and sons, they recognized the authenticity in his words. Emily, meanwhile, continued her duties with a new sense of purpose. The story of Flight 417 had spread through her unit, not as gossip, but as a reminder of why their mission mattered. When another escort duty came up, she volunteered immediately. She kept the letter from Andre's mother in her desk drawer. It had arrived a week after the flight, thanking her not just for bringing her son home, but for defending his honor in the skies. "The man you told me about, the one who changed his mind, that's why Andre served," the letter read. "He believed everyone had good in them if you just gave them a chance to find it." The Iron Serpents noticed changes in their local chapter too. James had been a leader, someone the younger members looked up to. When he started spending his weekends at the VA instead of the bar, it sparked conversations. When he talked about his father's service, about the weight of silence between generations, others began sharing similar stories. A local news station picked up the story after one of the passengers posted about it online. They interviewed several people from the flight, including the college student who'd wanted to record everything, but chose not to. "Some moments are too real for social media," she explained. "Sometimes you just need to be present, to witness." The story spread, not as viral sensation but as a quiet reminder of redemption's possibility. Hayes got calls from old military buddies who'd seen the coverage, each sharing similar stories of bridges built between veterans and their struggling children. James found himself speaking at a VA support group, sharing his journey with other children of Vietnam veterans. His voice still rough, his manner still direct, but now these traits carried understanding instead of anger. "I spent years being angry at my dad for his silence," he told them. "Never realized he was trying to protect me from his pain." One evening, he rode his motorcycle to his father's grave. He'd avoided visiting since the funeral, but something drew him there now. The plain headstone bore only his father's name and dates, no mention of service, no acknowledgement of sacrifice. James ran his fingers over the smooth stone, remembering. He'd brought new flowers and something else, a small Marine Corps medallion he'd found at a veteran's memorabilia shop. As he cleaned the grave and positioned the medallion, he talked to his father about everything: the flight, his volunteering, the changes he was trying to make. The silence felt different now, less like abandonment and more like the quiet understanding that sometimes grew between fathers and sons. The Iron Serpents underwent their own evolution. Under James's influence, they started a new tradition. Every month, they'd ride to various VA hospitals, spending time with veterans who didn't get many visitors. The sight of leather-clad bikers sitting quietly with aging soldiers, Listening to their stories became a regular occurrence. Emily kept in touch with Hayes, sending him updates about her service and the changes she'd observed since Flight 417. They never explicitly discussed the impact they'd had on James's life, but they didn't need to. Sometimes the most profound changes came not from confrontation but from showing someone a better path existed. A photo appeared on the VA office wall, James in his black jacket, surrounded by Vietnam veterans at a support group meeting. His father's dog tags caught the light, a bridge between generations. Below the photo, a simple quote from Andre's last letter. Sometimes the biggest acts of courage happen far from any battlefield. The media coverage eventually faded, but the ripple effects continued. Other motorcycle clubs reached out to James, asking how they could start similar programs. Veterans' families contacted him, sharing stories of their own struggles with understanding and forgiveness. Each connection reinforced what he'd learned miles above the clouds, that real strength often looked different than he'd once believed. 6 months after Flight 417, a crowd gathered at the local Veterans Memorial for a special ceremony. The morning sun caught the dew on fresh-cut grass as people filled the rows of chairs, veterans in pressed uniforms, families clutching photos of loved ones, bikers in leather jackets standing respectfully at the back. James stood at the podium, his hands steady despite his nerves. He'd traded his Iron Serpents vest for a simple black leather jacket with just 2 patches, his father's Marine Corps emblem and a new one reading, Veterans Alliance Motorcycle Corps, the organization he'd helped create from the ashes of his old life. "I never thought I'd be standing here," he began, his voice carrying across the quiet gathering. 6 months ago, I was a different person. Angry. Lost. Taking out my pain on the wrong people. He touched the dog tags around his neck, drawing strength from them. But sometimes life has a way of showing you your own reflection, even when you're not ready to see it. Emily sat in the front row, her dress uniform immaculate. Beside her, Hayes nodded encouragingly as James continued. They'd both come to support him, though neither had expected to see him transform quite like this. "My father was a Vietnam veteran," James continued, emotion roughening his voice. "He carried wounds I couldn't see and fought battles I couldn't understand. I spent years being angry at him for his silence, never realizing that sometimes silence is all some warriors have left to shield their families from what they've seen." In the audience, other children of Vietnam veterans nodded, recognition in their eyes. James had become a regular speaker at VA support groups, his story resonating with others who'd struggled to understand their parents' experiences. 6 months ago, on a flight from Dallas to New York, I dishonored everything my father stood for. I mocked a fallen soldier being escorted home, thinking I was proving something about being tough. He paused, looking out at the faces before him. Instead, I learned what real toughness looks like. It looks like Private Emily Ross, standing guard over Sergeant Andre Taylor's casket with unwavering dignity despite my disrespect. It looks like Colonel Hayes, who showed me that true strength isn't about intimidation, but about standing up for what's right. James's voice grew stronger as he continued. That flight changed more than just my attitude. It made me look hard at who I was and who I wanted to be. It made me understand what my father couldn't tell me, that service isn't about glory or recognition. It's about standing between the darkness and the light, about doing what's right even when no one's watching. The Veterans Alliance Motorcycle Corps members stood tall in their new jackets, each bearing the simple patch James had designed, a motorcycle wheel intertwined with a military service ribbon. They'd grown from a handful of former Iron Serpents to over 50 members, all dedicated to supporting veterans and their families. "Today, we're not just dedicating this new memorial section," James said, gesturing to the carved stone behind him. "We're dedicating ourselves to remembering that every veteran's story matters. Every sacrifice counts, even the ones that were never officially recorded." He stepped away from the podium then, walking to the memorial wall where a new panel had been installed. The morning sun caught the freshly carved names, dozens of Vietnam veterans who died years after the war, their service-connected disabilities finally recognized. Michael J. Reynolds was among them, his name no longer hidden in silence. Emily approached the wall after the ceremony, placing a Medal of Honor next to Andre Taylor's name. She'd received it anonymously in the mail, with a note saying it belonged with someone who'd truly earned it. As she stepped back, she saw James kneeling by his father's name, tracing the letters with rough fingers. Hayes joined them, his presence as steady as it had been that day on the plane. "Your father would be proud," he said quietly to James. "Not just of this, but of who you've become." James nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Around them, other families approached the wall, some leaving flowers, others just standing in quiet reflection. The Veterans Alliance members stood guard, offering silent support to those who needed it. Later, as the crowd thinned, James made his way to Andre's grave. He'd visited regularly since that first time, each visit a reminder of the change that had started miles above the clouds. The small Marine Corps medallion he'd placed months ago had been joined by others, tokens of respect from fellow veterans and family members touched by the story of Flight 417. "Thank you," he whispered, though whether to Andre, his father, or all of them, he wasn't sure. The afternoon sun warmed the stone, and a gentle breeze carried the sound of motorcycles in the distance, his new brotherhood heading out to another VA hospital visit. Emily and Hayes watched from a respectful distance as James stood at attention, offering a final salute. His father's dog tags caught the light, a bridge between past and present, between who he had been and who he had become. The story of Flight 417 had ended, but its legacy lived on in every veteran welcomed home, every family member who found understanding, and every life touched by the reminder that it's never too late to choose a better path.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.